Welcome to our Film Studies online discussion of Johnny Guitar. I am joined by my colleague, BMFI's Special Programming Manager, Jacob Mazer. Jacob, how are you tonight?
I'm well, thanks, Andrew. Looking forward to talking about this one-of-a-kind film.
Yes, I think one of a kind is an apt description. We may hear some other apt descriptions that may or may not contain four-letter words. Who knows? We'll see. But I kid, and I kid Jacob because this is one of his favorites, but I think it's a very interesting film, and I'm glad you all are here to discuss it with us. In order to facilitate that, please make note of the Zoom overview currently on your screen. Please keep yourself muted unless you have a question or comment, and I call on you to make that question or comment. I will know to call on you because you will please kindly raise your hand within Zoom, as you can see on your screen down at the bottom by the number 2. Use the raise hand feature. I will call on you, at which point you can ask your question or make your comment, and then please mute yourself as Jacob and I respond. And I will call on people in order. Unless people come back around with additional comments, I will try to get to people first who haven't yet made a comment. And then if there's time at the end, come back to people who have made more than one, who are making, a second or third statement or question. And we have a chat function in Zoom, as I'm sure you're familiar with by now, and we would love for you to please pop in and introduce yourself in there to us and to your fellow discussion participants, particularly if you are not from the greater Philadelphia area. And if you'd like to send us a longer introduction, let us know how you found us, how you think we're doing with our programs, and you are from outside the area, please visit the What in the World section of the Film Studies online section of brynmarfilm.org. And we would love for you to let us know where you're from. We've had people joining us from all over the country and even other countries. So it'd be great to learn more about that. And with that, I believe we can jump right in to the discussion. And I see some of our regulars have their hands up bright and early, as we expect. So I will start with David. David, good evening.
Good evening. And Jacob, your selection was certainly an interesting one. I think that some people could watch this film twice and once think it was one of the best films they had seen, and another time think that it was almost boring. I chose the first one. I really enjoyed the interplay. I was tempted not to raise my hand early on. If I could have managed to find a way for only the women to comment tonight, that would have been one of my better comments about the film. I thought that this was an amazing time in history for two strong female characters to take over the film and to watch the interplay. I'm not going to use a 4-letter word. I'll use a 5-letter word that some of the reviewers used. Two bitches on wheels going after each other. I really liked the way Joan Crawford addressed that juxtaposition. I really didn't think Mercedes McCambridge did as good a job, but I still loved watching the two of them with the fight. And to see Emma riding at the front of the posse was just such an amazing characterization. I guess I'll leave my question for Jacob on whether you agree, or some discussion on the relative strength of the two women actresses playing their role. And again, thank you. This was fun to watch.
Well, thanks for those comments and that sort of discussion prompt there, David. Jacob, did you have any thoughts on David's comments?
Absolutely, David. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed the film. So a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, you're correct in pointing out the significance and how rare it was for the time period to have two women playing the lead roles, not just the protagonist, but the antagonist. Certainly, these are not the types of roles that we are used to seeing women play in films of this period, particularly in the Western genre. although there would be more feminist Westerns to follow. It's interesting, too, to note, not only are the women sort of elevated and centered, but the film sort of treats its masculine heroes in, I think, some interesting ways, too. And perhaps that's something that we can, and it treats their masculinity and this sort of cowboy machismo that we're used to seeing in Westerns, I think, with a curious touch and perhaps a critical eye that we're not often used to seeing in Westerns of this period. Perhaps we can continue to talk about that over the course of our discussion. Now, you raised the question about the strength of the two actresses, Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge. I think they're both great. I think one thing that is, cool about the movie and that gives it a sort of punch is that this sort of sense of antipathy between them, I think, is quite tangible. And apparently this was a sort of accurate portrayal of their relationship on set. They did not like each other. I think Mercedes McCambridge called Joan Crawford a mean, tipsy, rotten egg lady, which is strong words about one's co-star. They feuded on set. Joan Crawford apparently went into, I guess, Mercedes Cambridge's dressing room, took out all of her clothes and threw them in the street during one section of filming. So perhaps not the ideal relationship between colleagues, but it gives their on-screen chemistry some oomph. To the relative merits of the actresses, I think Mercedes McCambridge is great. I think the scene where we watch her watch Vienna's tavern burn is, one of the best evil glee scenes that we see in film. But that said, Joan Crawford is pretty stiff competition. She's a divisive performer. Some people like her, some people don't, but I think it's undeniable that she has this sort of power. She's a really strong presence. And I think in almost every film that she's in, even when she's playing against some, very respectable other talents, she has this assertiveness that really brings her to the top. And, I feel like every time she's on scene in Johnny Guitar, she dominates it too. So that's my take. What did you think, Andrew?
I mean, I agree with what you said. I think that, we see in this movie why Joan Crawford was a movie star and was a movie star of such longevity. She gets her moments in the spotlight in the film, and so does Mercedes McCambridge. But there's something about Joan Crawford's moments where she really pops. And now part of that could be that, she's the protagonist rather than the antagonist, and part of it could be that she was supposedly having an affair with Nicholas Ray at the time, so maybe he favored her on screen a bit. But what I tend to chalk it up to is, by this point, she's been in the movies for 30 years, and you don't survive in the Hollywood of the studio era with her various attributes, both good and bad, for 30 years, unless you are very, very, very good at your job. And I think that we see in this movie, that some people may say is campy or some people may find distancing. I think we see in Joan Crawford someone embracing the role and embracing the project of the movie, even though I could very easily see it being, seeming like a challenging endeavor. Now, from what I've read, she was very much involved in the film getting made, that she had the rights to the novel on which it was based, and she picked Ray to direct it. And when it was put into turnaround at Paramount, she brought it to Republic. Republic, on the one hand, Republic makes sense because Republic churned out Westerns like McDonald's churns out hamburgers. But on the other hand, it was very much I think saying second tier studio is being probably generous to it. And for a star like Crawford, and for that matter, a director like Ray, to go there, I imagine probably must have been a little bit humbling. But they kept their eye on the prize, and they got to make the film they wanted to, at least by and large. I mean, I was struck watching the credits. I don't know if any of you were. I mean, I knew what Republic was, but if I didn't know what Republic was, seeing all the special effects done by Consolidated Film Services, I mean, that's like Wile E. Coyote getting his equipment from the Acme, company. It just says that this is a kind of a bare bones thing. And that being said, I think it's a very rich film visually as well. So I think that there's a lot to recommend it, even though it is in many ways unconventional. Let's see, Joss, you have a question or comment?
Yes. You've already answered my question about Republic Pictures. I mean, this film had all the elements of a typical Western. But the Western genre is really the myth of, it doesn't take place in any real historic time or place. It's all very mythic anyway. But this seemed to take that to a whole new level. I mean, this whole theme almost felt like a fantasy or a dream. I mean, just the archness of the characters and the colors and the images, just the primary colors all through this thing. And what was that elaborate saloon doing in the middle of nowhere? I mean, it's like they were stoned or something doing this whole thing. And which was even more than the usual Western, which was much more straightforward. I didn't love this film, but it certainly was interesting. I thought that, we've already talked about the two main characters, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. I did have one other question that's not of any importance to the theme, but this film is shot with the true color process, which I'd never encountered before, and just wonder if either of you knows anything about it, because it apparently wasn't around for very long. Anyway, worth seeing. I didn't love it, but it was certainly an interesting film to watch.
Well, thank you, Joss. I would put True Color in the same category as Republic Pictures and Consolidated Film Services. I have to say that, as you might imagine, I've watched a lot of movies from the 40s and 50s and 60s when special color processes were all the rage. And I don't remember the last time I saw a movie with made by the True Color process. So I assumed it was sort of the off-brand Technicolor, that it was, at this point in time, it would have been some sort of special color process as sort of the standard kind of Kodak one strip color film that, we all grew up basically using the still equivalent of on our cameras. Wasn't in Hollywood yet. So it was some version of a special process. I imagine it being a less expensive version and less cumbersome version of Technicolor, which was both very expensive and required a special camera that was very cumbersome. And though there were clearly some close-ups that were shot in the studio, there was a fair amount of location shooting, and that would have been a bear and would have slowed down production, something that Republic wouldn't have tolerated, I don't believe. So that's, I don't know specifically about True Color, but that's my sense of it. Jacob, did you have anything to add?
Certainly. Thank you for your comments. I wanted to comment on the sort of, you talked a little bit about the way that the sort of West is sort of handled in this film, in this sort of hyper mythic West. And I think that's exactly right. I want to make a couple comments about that. I think, and perhaps we'll talk about it, in further detail as we go through. So, right, as you say, there's this sort of mythic element that's kind of like built into the Western genre in its like sort of tropes. There are often there's this sort of, magnificent grand landscape that figures in, most of the time. Many times the stories are epic. There are these sort of archetypes that recur through it. So there's this sort of mythic dimension of, the Western as it is. In Johnny Guitar, though, I think, Johnny Guitar sort of takes that Western element and it sort of blows it into this almost operatic, place. And I really mean operatic, not just in the sort of bombast and the scale, but it feels a little bit like an opera, like The Magic Flute or something. Like it has this sort of fairy tale element to it, and the sort of Western landscape starts to play into that. You mentioned Vienna's saloon out in the middle of nowhere, and you notice when Johnny first arrives at the beginning of the movie, it's like enshrouded by this dust storm that seems to have kicked up out of nowhere and exists only around the only around the saloon. And there, that and other elements that come up throughout the film sort of give it sort of fairy tale fable feel. Now, I want to say one other thing about the sort of Western framing here, which is that, one thing that you see in the Western genre is that, oftentimes the period that it is commenting on is not, the age that it's portraying. It is the age in which it's being made. And I think this is true in Johnny Guitar as well. There's certainly I think, critique or comment on the Red Scare McCarthyism paranoia of the era. And we can go into that more later. But there's also, I think it's also worth noting that the West that we see in this film is one that is on the verge of transformation. The railroad is going to come through. It's going to change the way of life. And one of the sort of threads that goes through the film is the various different parties are dealing with that and preparing for it and accepting of that in different ways. So I think that has a sort of resonance in the period of the film's making too, in the 1950s, particularly in the way that women were emerging in society. This was during the post-war period. Men had gone to war, women had entered the workplace. By this time, of course, the war was over, but women had, the role of women in society had changed. And one of the things that culture was, grappling with was, what's this new world going to look like? And so I think some of the sort of gender issues that we see and some of the sort of dynamics between men and women and the treatments of masculinity and femininity that we see in the film are also in some ways playing into and commenting on the, the social changes that were happening in America during the period of the 1950s.
I mean, the movie's clearly, as Jacob suggested, is clearly aware that it is made in a culture in transition, and it is made in, and the movie acknowledges this. Something I don't think I've ever heard before in a Western. One of the times Joan Crawford's being threatened, she says something about making it to the 20th century. And that notion that people in Westerns are in sight of the 20th century is something that you didn't typically hear. You certainly didn't hear it in Westerns in the 50s. But if we think about all the changes that are happening in American culture at this time, there are the ones Jacob mentioned. I'll mention a few more. There is the strong presence of television, which at this time is still seen as competition to the movies rather than a great ally to the movies, as it would be seen probably by the end of the decade. There are social changes going on. You have concerns about suburban life and urban life that are different. You have one thread that they share that is a huge issue, juvenile delinquency, which will be the subject of a Nicholas Ray film the following year, Rebel Without a Cause. You have the Kinsey study. You have about sexuality. You have I think his name is Dr. Wortham, the man who would ultimately create Wonder Woman and writes his own interesting and popular book about sexuality. You have psychoanalysis in American popular culture in a way it hadn't been before. So there's a lot going on, and I don't know if one of the challenges of this film is that it is that the makers are aware of all these things going on and are trying to pack them in there, or if some of us as viewers are aware of all those things and sort of don't know kind of which themes of change and challenge to convention we know to latch onto, or we are to latch onto. But I think there's something in there for any of those topics and more. Let's see. Ellen, you have a question or comment?
I'm not Ellen. Ellen got a little angry because the lead person suggested that you ought to select some women. And of course, what followed were all the men, of which I have to confess I'm a man too. So she was a little annoyed with that.
Well, as I mentioned at the top, I don't know I know what the name says on the screen. I don't know who's there, and I pick them in the order they come. So I'm sorry that Ellen was upset, but
yeah,
she
felt you ought to have some women, but I'm not a woman. I have to tell you, I didn't particularly like the movie. It was interesting. I was raised on the genre of Westerns, going to many matinees, I think many by Republic, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers. And this one, of course, to me seemed like a kind of satire on those. It sort of upended it. As was pointed out in the introduction, it was very talky. Everybody seemed to be spilling their inner guts, unlike the laconic Westerns that I was used to. Everybody seemed to speak in caps. Everybody was loud. Everybody seemed very angry, so that you never could quite figure out why they were so angry and why they all had to talk in caps. So I guess if it's a satire, and a kind of silly satire, I guess it succeeded. That's all I would say about it.
All right. Well, thank you, Howard. I don't think it is intended to be a satire, but I will grant you, certainly, 2 points that I think make it a challenge, but are not necessarily criticisms. One is, it is very different from the Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, or even John Wayne, type of Western. I grant you that. Although I will say that if you look at the Westerns coming out in the 50s, this movie comes out midway between High Noon and The Searchers. There's a lot more talk in movies like those two about what the heroes are going through than there was in a movie like Stagecoach or earlier Westerns. And that's because the genre is changing. The genre in the 1950s enters the phase known as the psychological Western, where it's not just Western people doing the things that we automatically assume they will do because that's the good guy, that's the bad guy, but it's more about an exploration of why they're doing what they're doing. And this film, perhaps, you could argue, errs too much in presenting too much of that, but that's the cycle of the genre. I think the other thing that makes this film a challenge is that it doesn't seem to be about any of the themes that we immediately think of when we think of the Western. I think it's implicitly about some of the things that Westerns are implicitly about, namely the individual freedom, that all the people who went out west during the era when movies like this and the ones other ones we're talking about in the genre are set, are people who went there for a reason. That there was something that was more appealing about a relatively unsettled and quote unquote uncivilized area than there was about an area that was very much civilized and filled with rules and the mechanisms for enforcing those rules. That element of this movie is very clear and is a big part of it. And I think that in that sense, it has a serious connection to the conventions of the Western, but I will grant you that on a more overt manifest level, those might not be so obvious. In fact, the movie I kept thinking about when watching this this time was Brokeback Mountain, because that is a movie that I would say has many of the iconic elements of a Western, just like this movie does, but didn't seem all that interested in what we would tend to associate with the Western as its major themes. But implicitly, just like this movie, has that notion of people going out and being free and not having to be subjected to the rules and laws and judgments of a rigid and perhaps archaic society. And in that sense, the movies share something with each other as well as with more conventional Westerns. Jacob.
Yeah, so I want to speak to I want to speak about the film's status as Western a little bit. It certainly is a curious Western, certainly doesn't feel like Westerns. And I think it's helpful to understand Johnny Guitar not so much as a Western that, like a Western that's not totally acting like a Western, but as a sort of hybrid film. Okay, so certainly we're dealing with, some recognizably Western elements, but I think there are just as many elements that come from another genre that had really emerged as a cultural, market force in Hollywood over the previous decade in the 1940s and would continue to become, to flourish in the 1950s, which is the melodrama. And I'll give my quick sort of reductive explanation of the melodrama as, a film genre. But, basically these were films that mostly dealt in the domestic sphere, often had female protagonists, and were tended to be about issues related to self-sacrifice, love, and frustrated love, fulfillment and unfulfillment, social problems, and oftentimes, issues that were considered, like women's issues. And they tended to be told in, although they, often took place in sort of realistic environments, the presentation tended to be sort of bombastic and expressive and operatic, again, is this word that I'll keep using. So I think we can certainly see that element in elements of that genre in Johnny Guitar as well. And I should also note about the melodrama that many of these were geared and marketed towards women who had started to gain more economic power during the 1940s and were going to see movies and were interested and would buy tickets to movies about issues that they could recognize from their own lives. So I think one of the things that sort of characterizes Johnny Guitar as a genre work is that it's sort of suturing together these two genres. One, which is the sort of quote unquote, masculine genre of the Western. One, which is the sort of quote unquote feminine genre of the melodrama. And it sort of, stitches them together into this film. And the plot of this film and the dynamics of this film, I think, call into question many of the sort of conventional genre roles and notions that, men and women traditionally had at that period. So I think part of the sort of genre confusion is is by intention, or it's at least, you know, I think a powerful effect of the film. And I think it, and I think, you know, I think there's a harmony between the subject matter of the film and the sort of way it treats its genre, you know, as well. So, you know, it's a bit of a strange experience watching it, especially if you're not as familiar with the melodrama genre, which is not as popular these days. But I do think it sheds some light on what this film is doing and what it means.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and it's an important one to keep in mind. And we're quite used to, over the last several decades, genre hybrids. That's a natural evolution of genres. You know, we like genres because of their consistency, but because they are a creative form, because they are an art form, and because they are at home in a business that is Hollywood, they have to change over the time. They have to be both the same and different. And one of the ways they change over time is they mix with other genres. They try these experiments. And it's unusual to see genre experiments, particularly one as ambitious as this one, in the Hollywood studio system, which was still, you know, near the peak of its dominance in the early 1950s. But I have to say, Joan Crawford starred in a genre hybrid in 9 years before this one that was enormously successful, called Mildred Pierce. Now, that one could certainly argue that those were genres that were much closer in a few ways, and not the least of which was in terms of their typical settings, and that made melding them easier. But this was something she had done before to great success, and I think it's much more here. It's much more successful, I think, as it's much more ambitious and much more successful as an exercise than as a seamless piece of entertainment. And you know, people who have an issue with that, they're perfectly right in having an issue with that, because that's what films, particularly at that time, were supposed to be, or that was a large part of their mission. But I think that if we think about this movie as in the way Jacob said, which is this combination of melodrama and Western, it makes a lot more sense. And it's even a lot more enjoyable, because now, instead of expecting purely Roy Rogers and Gene Autry, we have our expectations balanced. So I think that's very helpful. Roseann, you have a question or comment? Okay, Roseann, you went away. If you raise your hand again if you do have a comment or question. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for taking my question and comment. I have my comment I'll do first. I really did love this movie. I think it was a great pick, Jacob. You know, I've been a fan of Westerns throughout my life, and I love this because it should have been titled Go West, not necessarily Young Woman, but Go West Woman. And she goes west and makes a life for herself, and her enemy becomes Emma. And so my question is, how does Emma know, you know, that how does Emma form this opinion of her that, you know, she's not there to do good? I mean, she's there to make money just like everybody else who goes west. She's there to make a living for herself. And she creates this beautiful environment. And I agree with the first caller that it seems, you know, a little eccentric, that the, you know, place that she builds in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful. But how does Emma come to this conclusion without knowing her?
That's a good question. And I think it's instructive for making better sense of the film for those who are having a challenge. So we'll talk about that. Thank you, Roseann. I just want to say before I forget, the Roseann was the second person, at least, to make the comment about this beautiful building, saloon, and combination saloon and boudoir that Joan Crawford builds out in the middle of nowhere. She builds it there because the train is coming there. And in that first scene where she's talking to that man having dinner with that man in her room, he said, "How did you know the train was coming this way?" And she says, "I ran into one of your surveyors." So it's the middle of nowhere now, but as she says at different points, people will come. She just has to, her plan is she has to hold out from those town interests long enough for the train to come that way, and then all will make sense and the money will flow in. So there's a rationale presented within the film for that element of it, but I don't think there's a clear rationale or an obvious rationale presented in the film for Emma's hostility toward her, but I think there are some implicit possibilities that I will leave to Jacob to discuss.
Sure. So this is a great question. I'm glad also we've been talking about the outside of the film and the genre of the film, and I'm glad we're cracking into it a little bit. So the question is, why is Emma so hostile to Vienna or Joan Crawford? It's hard not to see Joan Crawford shining through the part of Vienna. Let me offer 3 theories, and I'm going to offer them briefly without much detail because I see we have some other hands raised here. So a couple thoughts why things that I think the film suggests could be motivations behind Emma's fierce, reflexive hatred of Vienna. 1, Vienna represents a change in their lives. The railroad is going to come to town. Emma is a rancher. She and, by extension, her family and the other people in town make their living running cattle in the wide open spaces. But the railroad is going to come to town. Vienna's plan is to build up a town around the railroad station that will come there, and more people will come, and more people will buy property, and the sort of ranching economy and way of life could be on its way out. Emma sort of says as much, at a certain point when she's mustering the posse. And so when Joan says, I'm going to die here in the 20th century, she really is a representative of the 20th century. She really is a representative of the new West that's going to come. And Emma is part of the old West that is going to be supplanted. So perhaps this is one reason. A second reason, we understand, the film doesn't come out and say it, but I think it suggests it fairly strongly, that at least some of the money that Vienna has used to build her saloon and to buy her land comes from wheeling and dealing, and perhaps from prostitution or some kind of sex work. Again, the film doesn't come out and say this, but I think the implication is there. And this is something that sort of incenses the people of the town, because women who do that in their minds are not supposed to have power, but Vienna has, done that and has gained power. And so they see her as illegitimate, perhaps. A third reason why Emma might be so hostile to Vienna. Emma seems kind of repressed, and who the source of her repressed desire is, we can argue about, whether it's the dancing kid or whether it's Vienna herself. Vienna does not seem repressed. She seems to be very comfortable taking lovers, and letting them go as it happens, as she pleases. She doesn't seem to be particularly anguished about doing that or feel guilt about having those needs and following them. And I think perhaps some of the hostility that Emma feels could have to do with that as well. So those are a couple of options. maybe some of them have resonance for you, maybe not.
I think all of those are valid interpretations. I want to mention, going back to the very valid point that I've made before and that Jacob made tonight about films being about the time in which they're made and not the time in which they are set. This movie comes out around the time, not at the time, and I know this is probably more historical coincidence than anything else, but around the time that Dwight Eisenhower signs the bill authorizing interstate highways. And the fact here is that the railroad is going to basically draw attention away from downtown and bring it out to what had been the hinterland where Vienna had the foresight to build her chalet. Is not unlike what would, or is in a way sort of the reverse of what would happen. Actually, no, I guess it's the same thing, that interstates would move traffic away from downtowns and make businesses and people who had, and there were many of these people across the country who had staked their claims by setting up shop on Main Street, would in some ways damage their source of income and their existence, because traffic got massively rerouted. And so in some sense, there's a very practical reason for that hostility here. But I think the one that we're all interested in, and the one that's been brought up in the chat, and the one that the film goes to pretty good lengths for its time to suggest, is that Emma has feelings or lust or attraction that she doesn't understand or can't explain for Vienna. There is lip service paid to her being interested in the dancing cowboy or whatever he's called. It's such a ridiculous name, and he's so inconsequential I can't even bother to remember.
Harsh.
but I'm sorry, the dancing kid.
There you go.
But none of us believes that, and the movie seems to dispense with it after that opening scene. Basically, that first confrontation is, I know you're upset because the kid doesn't like you, and then now we can talk about what we really want to talk about, which is, you have an obsession with me, that Vienna, that you can't handle, you can't abide, you're ashamed of, or you can't, that will be unrequited, take your pick. But that's clearly what's going on here. And even though the film was not intended to have initially, or the desire of the filmmakers was not initially to have Mercedes McCambridge in the role of Emma, they had talked about Barbara Stanwyck and Claire Trevor, who were, I think, too expensive and unavailable respectively. Mercedes McCambridge, this would not be the only time that she played a character who was coded in the Hollywood, parlance of the time as a lesbian. And I think that's what's happening here as well. And as far as the Joan Crawford character, I don't think her orientation is made as clear or as uniform or homogenous, I guess I should say, in the film. Although in that first scene, one of her employees says something about, she's more man than many men I've met, or something along those lines. So that's Hollywood's way of telling us that that's a strong undercurrent, at the very least, for the film. Janice, you have a question or comment?
Yes. My thoughts on the film went very much along with the comments before about it being about the relationships between the women. And when you were talking about the times, in the 50s, if you remember, it was really a difficult time for men in accepting that their women didn't want to go back home. And there was a great deal of difficulty going on about that. And it was before the 60s, and the 60s were, in response to that. I also noticed that at the beginning, a lot of the men didn't like this movie. And I think that that may also have had to do with that it wasn't your typical Western, and that it was more about the relationships of the women. I'm seeing it as more nuanced now, but when I watched the movie, I really thought it was about a cat fight between the women. That, that they, well, that the Joan Crawford character just assumed she could have whatever she wanted, and she did. And that the other woman wanted the man, but I'm seeing it in a more nuanced light. And I think I agree with what Jacob said about the possible lesbian undertones with it. But I can understand, in a way, I react negatively to the men were like, whoa, this is not my usual Western that I love. It wasn't all about shoot 'em up.
Well, thanks, Janice. I think, to be fair to the men, if we had emphasized, and if the film had emphasized its melodramatic elements, and so the melodrama's typical audience with its expectations had shown up, they would have been disappointed too. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why the movie was not well received by critics or audiences at the time of its original release, which is it was too much of a Western for melodrama fans, and it was too much of a melodrama for Western fans. And as I said, a while back, really an ambitious endeavor. And I think that, one of the criticisms levied at melodramas during this time, and it's certainly a valid one, is that for all their talk of being stories about women and stories for women and putting on screen, the American woman's experience, too many of them fell into the trap of having so much of that woman's experience, that so-called woman's experience, being about the woman wanting a man or trying to get a man or trying to decide between two men or having to best another woman for a man. And this movie, of course, initially, at least, nominally, starts there, but it doesn't really seem to be so preoccupied with that, which is, I think, a refreshing choice. Jacob, did you have anything to say in response to those last comments?
I'll just say briefly, I thought your comments were dead on. I'll just give you a little bit of context about Joan Crawford, perhaps, which is that, Joan Crawford, as Andrew mentioned before, had been famous by this time for 30 years. I mean, her breakthrough film was like in the late 1920s. So she had sort of gone through a period of being something like a more conventional starlet, as it were. And sort of as she, entered her 30s and her 40s, and by the time she makes this film, she's 50. She had sort of rebranded herself and sort of revitalized her career during the 1940s, making films particularly about the experiences of women in this post-war period. A lot of her films, including Mildred Pierce, the most famous one of them, but many other films that came out through the 1940s and up through Johnny Guitar are really speaking to this subject. And so, Joan Crawford was one of those actors who was so famous that she was like herself almost like a brand, She's like always kind of playing Joan. The same way like somebody like George Clooney, if you see him in a movie, is always sort of, he's playing his character, but he's also playing George Clooney, and there's other analogs for that. Same thing with Joan Crawford. She herself is a strong presence. And I think understanding that context and the sort of arc of her career up to Johnny Guitar, really emphasizes, that point and that sort of resonance with the situation of women in this new sort of post-war landscape.
Louis, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the extraordinary use, not just of the staginess of the film, but of the stagecraft. I believe Jacob in his introduction mentioned that Ray was an experimental theater director before he did this film. And there are many, many instances throughout the film when the ongoing story of the film is suspended for some moment. So for a brief moment, so a character can seem to come up to the frontal plane of the space and almost address an off-screen anonymous viewer and suspend the ongoing story. And that happens not just in terms of space, but in terms of time. I believe there was a really amazing scene where they're in the carriage on the way to the bank, I think, where instead of the carriage moving consistently in one direction, the screen line is crossed, a complete violation of all the Hollywood rules. And they keep going back and forth. And although the carriage is supposedly moving forward in time, it's just suspended there in the middle. And this was just amazing to me how this whole other space, which could be the audience, could be an anonymous viewer or another story entirely, was brought into the film. I'm wondering if anybody had anything to say about that.
Thanks for that, Louis. I did notice some interesting choices in terms of framing and editing, as you mentioned, in this movie. I was surprised by them. Jacob, did you have thoughts on Louis's point or related ones?
Thanks for your comment, Louis. I don't know that I can offer a sort of cohesive theory, but I do think I guess some of those elements remind me a little bit of they call to mind the sort of operatic elements of the film a little bit, where, as in an opera, or perhaps in a stage play with a soliloquy, characters sort of might step out of the action a little bit and address themselves directly to the audience. There's some element of that in Johnny too, and to me it sort of builds into the sort of mythic and operatic architecture of the film. But yeah, it's a sort of there's a sort of dream sense to the film. Like, I think I described it in the introduction. I think I used the word delirium. And I think that's like I think there is that element of the film. It's a little bit crazy and it feels a little bit unmoored, but that's something about it that I think is a sort of delicious quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a moment early on where one of her employees turns and starts to walk toward the sort of the kitchen, and he's walking toward the kitchen and the camera cuts to him and he starts to talk in direct address to the camera. But then as he's talking, there's another cut and we realize he's at the doors to the kitchen and he's talking to John Carradine in the kitchen. But for a split second there, it seemed like he was presenting in direct address to the audience. When the dancing kid first comes into the saloon and Joan Crawford's between him and Johnny, she's turned and she's ostensibly turned, sort of looking over the bar into the mirror away from the two of them, but it seems like she's addressing the audience directly as well. So there are those moments where the sort of I don't want to say the fourth wall is exactly broken, but they come very close to kind of, showing the mechanism of the filmmaking or referencing the mechanism of the filmmaking, which is a very unusual choice, but is in line with some of those, influences or tendencies for Ray. So I think there were some of those in the film.
Yeah, there is a very stagey sense to it too. Like there are scenes that go on and on and on and develop. Like the first, 35 minutes of the movie are, essentially like one extended scene. Johnny arrives at the at the saloon, and then, you know, other parties arrive and new people keep coming in and coming out. And, you know, the scene where where Sterling Hayden and Joan Crawford are sort of drinking together and their sort of first night at the saloon also has that element, and it sort of goes through these like different stages of the scene. So, I mean, I do think you can see Ray's, you know, influences from his, you know, work in theater there in ways too.
Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yep, hi. All right, so this movie was very challenging for me, extremely challenging. That's about as nicely as I can put it. However, when I got over how I felt about the movie and I decided to excavate a little bit, I realized that one of the things that really, really bothered me is the gender upheaval. We've been talking about that. But it was, to me, a gender upheaval, an experiment in trying to do a gender upheaval that really failed. And that's what bothered me. And it bothers me on a couple of levels. And that's kind of what I want to say. First of all, I think we need to give some props to the men in this movie who had to do a yeoman's job because they couldn't behave or act in the way they ever behave or act in any other things they do, including the way they're looked at in life. I mean, I think Sterling Hayden was a very sexy guy, and he would have made for a wonderful lover, and he didn't really get to do the things that a guy can do in movies, which is, I'm not sure what that says about me, but it's certainly one of the reasons that I found it troubling. I also loved John Carradine. I just think he did a little bit, but my heart went out to him when he died. So some of these ancillary moments with the men were I really wanted more of them. I felt kind of cheated because of the experiment in making the women be men and the men be more like women. And there was another moment too, where I think Ward Bond looked up at the head of the posse, and he sort of stood there like, "Ba-duh, ba-duh, ba-duh." I don't know what to do. So I guess what I'm saying is I think it's interesting to look at this movie as an experiment that did not work. But I think it's maybe even more interesting to ask the question, or at least I'm asking myself the question, well, why shouldn't it work? Why can't the women come across stronger? To me, it was a failure. In a romantic comedy, that's just not the way it goes. Now, I again, that may be just what the way it hit me, and it's troubling that it hit me that way, but it did. And so, I guess I'll sort of leave it at that. And maybe you can respond. Hope so.
Thanks, Dana. I mean, I think you pose some wonderful ideas, and the question you leave us with is a very good one, which was, if we agree on more or less what the movie was trying to do, and we also agree more or less that it at least wasn't entirely successful. I know some of you might say not at all successful, but not entirely successful at doing it. The question might be why, and I think part of it might rest in the fact that it was just too tall of an order for Hollywood at the time. That stars were so strongly defined, and their characteristics were so strongly set in the minds of filmmakers as well as moviegoers. The same was true with genres, and I think trying to do what this movie's trying to do in a Western may have been too tall of an order, given that genre's long and indelible history in Hollywood, and with audiences. But yeah, I agree that that's really one of the key questions to think about. Jacob.
Thanks for your comment, Dana. I'll give you my take. Well, first of all, let me just echo a positive comment that you made, which is on the merits of the sort of small characters in the film. And one thing that I think makes this, I think a lovely film, or one of my favorites, is that even the characters, to me, that have very small roles, are interesting. So speaking to your main point, I'll tell you my take, which is that I think the way that the film is treating gender when it does it the most successfully is it's not just doing a swap where, the women are imbued with, conventionally masculine traits and vice versa. But I think there are times where the film is treating, those like gender traits, like, the sort of gender idea itself as like this sort of performance, this thing the characters are sort of performing for each other, and that in some ways hinders them. So, let me go a little bit deeper. So, right, the film doesn't just center the women, but it, I think very conscientiously sort of pushes the men to the side and sort of makes fun of their machismo a little bit. There's a lot of talk in the film about the difference between being a man and a boy, and it's contained in this sort of witty repartee. But this is something that Joan chides Johnny about, and she chides Turkey about, and she chides the dancing kid about, and it sort of speaks to this sort of underlying insecurity about masculinity, which is the desire to be seen as a man and not a boy. And so the fact that the men are so sidelined that their sort of masculine gestures are teased a little bit, and that a lot of the sort of traditional cowboy machismo that you see in these type of films is like mostly used as a way for them to be like pushed around. I think is like a sort of knowing deconstruction on that sort of macho cowboy identity. Now, I think Vienna performs her sort of gender roles in an interesting way too. One of the things that strikes me in the film a lot is her costuming. And there's this note, I saw somebody make a mention of it in the chat, but there's this sort of curious part where she dresses in jeans and with a gun belt through a lot of the film. But there's the part where she puts on the white dress, to greet the posse, and she's putting on a performance for them. They're coming to lynch her, basically, and so she puts on this performance that's gonna turn down the temperature. And indeed, their enthusiasm and their sort of readiness to do that seems to mellow out. And it seems like it might have worked if Turkey hadn't rolled out from under the table. As soon as it's time to be to get back into action, she drops it. She's very conscientious about how she presents herself. And so, again, I mean, I think I think the film is not just sort of doing this sort of quality switch in the sort of, between the men and the women, but it's sort of playing with the sort of posturing and the sort of conventional ideas about like what is masculine, what is feminine in some interesting ways.
Barbara, you have a question or comment? Barbara Hirsch? No. Okay. Bonnie, you have a question or comment? Okay.
We're back.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Richard wanted to comment.
Sorry, Andrew, it was Barbara's name on the screen.
That's okay. Okay, go ahead.
Given the hour, I'll just say briefly, it's a shout out to my respect for Jacob that I hate Westerns of all kinds, but because he recommended this, I figured I'd give it a shot. I still respect Jacob. I didn't like the movie, but my question, seriously, I really respect what you guys choose. I think it's always thoughtful. My question is about the role of family in the movie, if you'd comment. Although Emma gives the boilerplate speech about how the foreigners are coming and they're going to like disrupt the family life that we all know, the two real families in the movie seem to be Vienna's staff, who are very loyal to her, and she reciprocates that. And in its own quirky way, the dancing kid, agree, Andrew, one of the worst nicknames ever, and he was a lousy dancer too. Except for Ernest Borgnine, who's like the difficult guy in the family. But that group and Vienna's family group seem to me to be the two real families, the authentic families in the movie. And I'm wondering if that speaks both to the time it depicts, when people were choosing to move west, and that inevitably meant leaving other blood family behind. And also some of the rearrangements of the 50s, when the movie's being made, about the way that secondary loyalties are functioning as family.
Yeah, Richard, I think that's a wonderful point. And we all, I shouldn't say we all, but the conventional view of the 1950s is that it's Leave It to Beaver and it's Father Knows Best, and it's the period of the nuclear family, and the nuclear family having their own homestead out in the suburbs, and on and on. And I think that probably is the convention of the time, to a large degree. And the points you make about these unconventional family arrangements and relationships, I think it's just another way in which this film goes against the grain of its period and is challenging its conventional wisdom. And I think it's a great observation, and I agree with your characterization of those two groups. Jacob.
Yeah, I think that's on point, Richard. Nicholas Ray, one of the through lines through his films is he's interested in people who don't fit in. People who who are sort of stick out of their the mainstream of what their society is. And so, it's telling that the two sort of affinity groups that he treats with the most affection are, the oddball ones. There's a famous scene in Rebel Without a Cause, Nicholas Ray's next film, where James Dean and Sal Mineo and Natalie Wood, they sneak into an abandoned, they're all these sort of oddballs in various ways, and they're, suburban community, and they don't fit in, and they're very unhappy there. And they sneak into this abandoned house and sort of play act being a family together. And this theme of the people who don't fit in coming together and, forming their own sort of surrogate family unit is one of the central themes of Nicholas Ray's work. That's an idea that he explores again and again. And I think you've put it well, how he does that in some ways in Johnny Guitar.
And in fact, in Rebel, the traditional nuclear family units are in shambles. Neither of the ones we get any glimpse of, actually none of the ones we get any glimpse of work well at all, and in fact are significantly dysfunctional. So this just supports those notions. Those are great points. Lillian, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I have a comment about the title character.
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody's talked about him too very much. Sterling Hayden as a physical entity couldn't be a better cowboy. But, I think his theme song could be a take on Dolly Parton's Stand By Your Man, because he stood by this woman. He's been in love with her for years. He's given up being a gunfighter, although he hasn't lost his talent. He comes when she calls him, and he's her hero. He's bent on saving her. He does save her life. And so I think this sort of, in a way, completes the role reversal that's going on in this movie.
Thank you for those comments. I do think that Stand By Your Man was made famous by Tammy Wynette, but I know that that's not really the point of your comment. The point of your comment was very interesting, which is that, the film is called Johnny Guitar. And I was thinking about how calling this movie Johnny Guitar makes as much sense as calling Clute Clute, because they're really about the these movies are about, both of those movies are about the women that those male title characters are, you know, drawn to, or you could say become, you know, to some extent obsessed with. And I do think that, I do think he is an interesting figure. And I do think he, and to a lesser extent, the dancing kid, are, you know, sort of exist sort of in the service of Vienna. They are there in supporting roles. I mean, Johnny occupies a place of more prominence and more import than her staff, but in many ways he functions similarly. And he's sort of first among equals, it seems to me, in that regard. But you know, that is one of the interesting ways, and I think successful ways, the film challenges the gender roles of the time, because while he gets to do some quote unquote masculine things, he's really not driving the events and making the decisions the way Vienna does. And those are two things that the male protagonist would typically do in any Hollywood movie of this period, but particularly a Western. Jacob.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. I wanted to talk about, I'm glad we have a chance to talk about the relationship between Vienna and Johnny a little bit, because one of the things that I think is like a little bit curious about the film, but I think is a merit, is that, like, however, although it's a sort of, has these sort of melodramatic elements to it, although the language is very bombastic and sort of elevated, I think their relationship in a lot of ways is like a fairly mature one. And mature in a way that we don't often see in like Hollywood movies, especially of this period. Like the place, you know, they have some difficulty with each other at the beginning. I mean, you know, they go through a sort of process together. But the place where they ultimately come to, and the basis on which they're able to form a relationship, is basically saying to each other, look, I know you have some stuff in your past, I have some stuff in my past, but we love each other, and, you know, and I accept you for who you are. And you know, I think, you know, you watch the scene where they have their sort of, you know, first tension and then, you know, eventual coming together, you know, when he's, you know, drinking whiskey, you know, by himself late at night in the saloon, and she comes down the stairs. And they go through this sort of process where they're sort of talking about their past, and he doesn't want to know about her past, and he doesn't want her to tell him how she got, you know, the money for the place, and she insists that he knows. You know, she wants to be accepted for who she is and for what she's done, and he, you know, at one point there's the part where he says, you know, lie to me, tell me you've been like waiting for me, you know, all this time. And he sort of, you know, I take it as him saying sort of, let's put aside the heavy, tough stuff and let's just, you know, let's just enjoy each other's company and be sentimental. And she won't give it to him, you know. And the point they have to come to is sort of accepting each other, which is, I think, you know, despite being sort of, you know, packaged in this sort of melodramatic, you know, even somewhat campy, you know, exterior, I think it's actually like a fairly, you know, nuanced and mature, you know, relationship between the two. So it's a thing I appreciate about the film.
Tracy, you have a question or comment? Tracy Weiss, are you there?
Here we go. I had to unmute.
Go ahead.
I saw Vienna's character as somebody who was, first of all, I really enjoyed the movie because it was advanced for its time. And she was definitely a business person. She had a vision for the future and a vision for the West. And as some of you pointed out, she was a harbinger of what was to come, for better or worse. But what I think went well beyond just sexual stereotype reversals is that in her strength and determination, and it wasn't always heroic. I mean, she was unpleasant as much as she was pleasant. These guys were really attracted to her, particularly Johnny Guitar. But I don't think it was like, hey, if you're feminine and you act in a masculine way, you're going to turn off all the guys. I think it was much more complex for that, particularly for that time period that it was made in.
No, I agree. I think that's a really good point. And I think that that's a trap that that movies even today fall into. And I think the movie makes the point of sort of avoiding that. In fact, she's attractive to men. And if our discussion of earlier has any merit, she's attractive to women as well. And I think you're right that those male characters find attractive in her the same attributes in the same way that in another Western a female character might find in a male character, the sort of the leadership, the assertiveness, the confidence, the determination, the drive. And it is very refreshing and indeed progressive, particularly for that time, to see that that is not a turnoff to these men, and these men aren't, maybe the dancing kid is to some extent with his name, but these men are depicted as conventionally masculine men for the time by and large. And they still find those elements, though they still find her attractive, arguably because of, rather than despite those attributes you outlined, Tracy. So I agree with you. That's a very important mark in the film's favor. Jacob.
I concur, Tracy. I think you're dead on here. I wanted to read a quote that I thought was relevant, and this is, I'm quoting the film critic Karina Longworth, who has a wonderful podcast called "You Must Remember This," and has some episodes about Joan Crawford. But she identifies the Crawfordian theme, like the central, Crawfordian theme, as, quote, "The way an aging woman's need to look out for herself can be at odds with traditional femininity." And I think that theme, animates Johnny Guitar in a really interesting and nuanced way. And we see, elements of sort of, the pole of both of those poles in the film. And I think one of the things that's excellent about the film that ultimately makes Vienna like a really compelling character and is sort of somebody that you admire and root for is that she doesn't have to be one way or the other. She's in a sort of difficult social position and she's making it work. And it's probably, one imagines a position that at least the sort of dynamics of some people in the audience, some women in the audience maybe could recognize and relate to, transposed into their own, circumstances. And indeed, Johnny Guitar was one of Nicholas Ray's biggest hits. So audiences responded to it.
Thank you, Jacob, for that that final fitting note, and thank you all for joining us. This was a wonderful discussion, and it especially appreciate the participation of folks that would not count this movie among their favorites. We need different opinions and different views, and if everyone feels the same way about the movie, it's not going to make for a great discussion. And I think we had a really good discussion tonight. We have one remote classroom seminar coming up before the end of the year. We will have more in 2021, but this one is taught by film critic Gary Kramer, who does a great job scouring festivals for fascinating short films to talk about the short films themselves and to talk about the form of short film more broadly. And the one we have coming up on the 8th is about family drama. So you can read the description on our website and find out more about it, and perhaps we will see you there. In addition, If you happened upon this discussion and want to make sure you don't miss any future ones, and we do them just about every Monday, please sign up for our emails. If you can do that by going to brynmarfilm.org and sign up for our emails, and every Thursday you'll get our education email that will direct you to the goings on at the Film Studies Online section of our website. We have other emails as well that will direct you toward the goings on in Theater 5, where you can watch new releases that are only available through BMFI. And Film Studies Online has a lot going on. It will let you know about these discussions. You can watch previous discussions. We have we have mini film lessons as Ask Andrew video segments. We have great puzzles. We have lots of film-related puzzles. We have lots of great stuff going on. So please visit brynmarfilm.org, check out Film Studies Online, and check out Theater 5 and sign up for our emails. And if you like what we're doing and you have the means, we would very much appreciate your support. We would all obviously rather be seeing these movies in the theater and discussing them in person, but until we can do that, we are going to keep providing free programs like this one and doing all the other work we're doing to keep Bryn Mawr Film Institute going and make sure we're ready when it's safe to open. And we need your help to do that. Your memberships are a tremendous help to us, but if you have the means and are inclined, please consider making a donation to Bryn Mawr Film Institute. We could certainly use your support that way, as we greatly appreciate and benefit from your support, both as members and in participating with us tonight. So it was great to see you. I look forward to seeing you all next week when we'll have another film to discuss. Jacob, thank you for joining me and for suggesting a film that led to a terrific discussion. It was a great one, and we look forward to seeing you all down the line. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.